Hello friends, for today's video we're back with another from readers, specifically regarding the topic of trends. The specific prompt that was posed over on the community tab and my Patreon stated, book trends of 2024. Which have you hated? Which have you loved? What old trends still persist that you can't believe have managed to exist for so long? And what are some you'd like back? Some of the topics I saw presented certainly are regarding some more controversial things, and I'm actually really looking forward to getting to see your perspectives on these. Before we jump into those things though, and starting it off more on a lovely note, I recently discovered an artist who I think is absolutely incredible, and this will actually tie back to one of the things that I saw mentioned in the trends, but regardless, I discovered this artist recently. I specifically found them over on Instagram, and I thought their artwork was incredible. And then when I was checking out more of their art, I was seeing that they make art for so many of the stories that I know a lot of you love, but also selfishly that I love, to a point where I was like, is this me if I was more talented? But I reached out to them and I asked if they wanted to do some kind of collaboration, if they would maybe want to send me any kind of prints or anything, and then I could share them with all of you, try to maybe get more eyes on their work. Maybe some of you can check out their prints. As always, I like to be as transparent as possible. If you do check them out, I'm not getting any kind of affiliate code. I'm not being paid. It was a very organic. I reached out to them and they so kindly did not only send me some prints, they sent me 4 prints of a particular size. I'll have all the details for the sizes and the frames and everything in the description bar, but they sent me 4 prints, and then as a bonus, they sent me this adorable, amazing Full Metal Alchemist print, and they sent me some Witch Hat Atelier stickers. It was so nice. They're so lovely, and I really want as many people as possible to check out their work because they're not only talented and gifted and make art for a lot of the stories we love, but they're also so darling and lovely. I am going to show the 4 prints. These are all specifically for Arcane. And I thought this was especially fitting to get prints for because 1, I love Arcane, but 2, it's actually these pieces that I discovered them through. So I'm going to start with Jinx and Vi. These prints are gorgeous. They're gorgeous. I do talk about manga, anime, those sorts of stories more on my side channel. And I actually, in talking about this artist over there, I mentioned that I feel like their style is a combination of having color use that is both muted and vibrant, which seems as though those two descriptions shouldn't go together. But don't you agree that they're almost like understated and sophisticated, but so beautiful and pretty at the same time? And I love the symbolism in the art, and I love the positioning of the characters, the expressions that they have. And it wasn't just those two. It wasn't just the Vi and Jinx art that they sent, but they also sent me Victor and Echo. And all of these are amazing. I plan to hang these in my office, but I wanted to first get to show them to you. I have been dying to hang them up though, but I was like, I gotta make sure I actually show them on camera here so that you have a better look at them, and then I'll go ahead and hang them up. But I think these are amazing. I'll insert some clips so you can see the stickers that they sent me and the Full Metal Alchemist art. So please check out their art. It is so exceptional and you will not be sorry. It's prettier in person even than it was when I saw the artwork online. Thank you so much to that artist. I'm so grateful for the prints. But now switching to trends. We have a couple from Patreon. As always, I always get through my patrons' responses first as a thank you to them for their continued support. Starting with that, and then we're going to segue to the community tab post. One of them said, for trends, I've noticed that this year there were less pure high fantasy releases. Almost all the big fantasy releases were mixed genres like The Tainted Cup or The Familiar, or they were sequels. Not that there's anything wrong with sequels. I've just noticed that the trend toward more easily digestible, low or urban fantasy. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I adored The Book of Doors because of the mix of modern and thriller elements, and I also love The Tainted Cup because of the detective elements. But I do hope that epic fantasy doesn't get lost in the process, because sometimes I just want to sink my teeth into an entirely new fantasy world with fantastic world building. I also have noticed what I think to be, anyway, a trend that I'm seeing, which is that more digestible type of fantasy. And my speculations as to why maybe this is the case is that in 2020, I think we saw an emergence of a number of things. 1, more people started to read or got back into reading because of the events of 2020. I don't think I have to give those details, but more people were getting into reading. But as a result of people maybe getting into it for the first time or getting back into it, you do want to start in a place that maybe isn't as daunting. There are those people that like to plunge head first into the deep end, but for a lot of people, they kind of ease in, and it's much easier to ease in when it's something that's a standalone, or when it's something like fantasy romance, or if it's contemporary fantasy, or if it's cozy fantasy, which is why I think cozy fantasy and fantasy romance have seen such a surge in how popular they are. But as a result, I think that the popularity then created what we're seeing now, which is a lot of releases for fantasy romance and for cozy fantasy. But I also think that publishing tends to assess pretty well, and I think that they have understood that if you push only one type of content out, content's not the right way to put it, but one kind of genre or subgenre out too much, then people will very quickly get tired of that. So they want to capture the feeling, and they want to capitalize on the popularity of these things, and they don't want to overdo it. So they have a lot of that, but then they also have more standalones, or they have more like what you talked about, these sort of detective fantasy stories, or these historical fantasy stories, things that you could maybe almost see being shelved in fiction instead of fantasy. And I think that maybe is where we're seeing the origin, was back from 2020 leading into 2024, which at this point we're starting to reach the final form almost of this, which is, it feels like every release now is somehow a genre bender, or it is a standalone, or it is a very low stakes sort of fantasy world or story. And I agree that this isn't a bad thing. I like that fantasy can open up. I like that it can become more accessible. And I like that we don't want to remain stuck in some of the places that I think fantasy was stuck in for a long time. I like that we're opening up and we're doing different things and we're expanding. But I'm also with you that that doesn't mean I want to lose epic fantasy. What I think that this can result in, that I think would be great, is if epic fantasy is not necessarily beholden to what epic fantasy was in the past. In the past, we sort of, I am very much generalizing, but I just kind of thrown out there that I think a lot of epic fantasy in the past was in some fashion sparked from some kind of Tolkien-esque world. And it was more mythology and medieval inspired. And I think what could be great is if we see the genre benders that start to become more of what we get in epic fantasy. If epic fantasy really pushes not just the scope, but also the creativity of what fantasy can be. That's part of why I love Winnowing Flames so much, which is right there. It's a trilogy. Epic fantasy, but it's, in my opinion, I would categorize it as epic sci-fantasy. It has pieces of fantasy that we've seen before and that we're familiar with, but it also is so off the walls and way out there, and the antagonists, I would say, are much more fitting of a sci-fi environment over the course of the trilogy. But it's unlike anything else, even though it has ingredients within it that feel familiar. Not that that's the only example. Of course, there's so many more, and feel free to elaborate on some that you think are present. I do want to add that I by no means think that this somehow dismisses what was just stated, but I do think if you are craving more epic fantasy, it is still present in a lot of self-pub circles. So for example, I often point to the Echo Saga as being not just epic fantasy, but kind of what a lot of us really think of when we think of epic fantasy. It is more so sort of that classic fantasy feel with the specific fantasy races that we're accustomed to, but I really like what the author has done with it, and I think it's both fun and familiar and action-packed and epic in scope. My one downside, though, in pointing this out is that self-pub works, sadly, do not have the same reach as traditional works do, meaning you're less likely to see them translated. They're not always as easy to purchase if you aren't within the UK or the US or places where you can have things shipped from the UK and US retailers. So I do find that it's not as easy to just point to self-pub and say, here, this fixes all of your problems. You're going to find all the epic fantasy you want over here. It's not quite that crisp because of the fact that not everybody has access the same way myself and a lot of us do. But I do think if you do have access, that there is still that over there. Doesn't change the fact, though, this is what I meant when I prefaced that point, that it doesn't change the fact that traditional publishing is not releasing as much epic fantasy these days, or at least not from what I have noticed. The other trend pointed out by a patron would say, I'm tired of the ACOTAR format, a court of blank and blank. And this is, I think, falling into the what's something that you can't believe has persisted. They go on to say, or a blank so blank and blank. For example, a curse so dark and lonely, a court of honey and ash, a court of sugar and spice, court of ravens and ruin, etc. So a blank of blank and blank has certainly carried on for a long time. I don't know if I've noticed just how much court has been used in titles. I mean, I think we can have a little more versatility within our titles, certainly. I do know that sometimes authors don't actually get to even title their works. It depends on how much of a staple you are in the genre. Sometimes if you're just starting out, the publisher decides for you what the title is going to be of your work. So I think sometimes people point to authors and then they're like, they're just trying to capitalize on. And it's like, well, I don't know about that. I think if we're going to point fingers, more than likely it's publishing. And also, we can come up with better titles. There is probably, though, some marketing reasons why they include that. I would think that in a way, by having these similarities, that people will see these books. If they go to type something in, these other books will pop up. So maybe, even though we don't like it, maybe it helps these newer authors have their books seen or recognized. I'm not sure. But I'll add that I have seen whenever somebody is kind of clever with their title or they have a title that's very different outside the norm, sometimes those get criticized too. So as an example, and if the person who mentioned this is watching, this isn't me trying to diss this point, it's just bringing into the equation that sometimes cleverness and originality doesn't necessarily always appeal to everyone. So the book, You Can't Spell Treason Without T. I remember when I talked about that book, someone's like, I just can't take seriously any book with a title like this. And so I was like, well, sure, if that's how you feel, you don't have to pick this up. But I think that sometimes we can go so far in the direction of trying to stand out that we actually lose some people. Anyway, segueing now into the community tab. And this is why I thought talking about the artwork in this video was relevant, because the first thing mentioned here is I hate the trend of using AI for covers. I completely agree. And it's not just for covers. I see a lot of people, I'm not even going to call them artists. I'm not sorry either for saying that. There are people online who have entire accounts of fan amalgamations, I'll call them, instead of saying fan art, where they will just have these accounts where they clearly are using some kind of AI generator to create, they just plug in descriptions of the characters and then they get these pieces and then they post them. And some of these accounts have so many followers, which a little bit, I don't really understand. I don't understand some of the people that read fantasy and they value the work of artists of all kinds, hopefully, not just authors, but of all kinds. And they recognize the amount of time and effort it takes. And also, for a lot of people, there's very little reward for putting in this much time and effort. Most people do not become incredibly wealthy or successful from their art. They do it because they have a passion, because they love this particular skill that they have to work at continuously, and they want to also share that with everyone else, which, how lucky for all of us. And then AI takes all of that work and then it profits off of it without any of those people getting to see any of the rewards. And then for people to come along and use that to get a large following online, I'm like, shame on you. If you actually do create, I mean, not that I think you should do this at all, but at least every single day or at every single time you post some of that garbage is what I'm going to call it, because that's what it is. When you post that, at least have the decency to share a real artist in your Instagram stories, or share another shot and say, check out this artist, they're a real one. Something. Give attention to the people who deserve it, because you only have an account off of their work. I can't stand it. And artists like the one I showed at the beginning deserve so much love for the work that they create. And they have such an imagination too. Like, some of the scenes they're depicting are purely from their own imagination, and that's incredible. And then they're sharing that with us, and art moves us in different ways. Visual art, or art that we consume via the stories that we read, or video games even, I think, have stories that are, I would argue, are art. And to have people that create, I don't even like saying the word create, that plug in some words and then try to pass it off as art, I don't understand the people that make that, and I don't understand the people that follow it. Knowing everything we know now, I could kind of understand initially when people didn't realize the negative repercussions of it, but now that we do know the negative repercussions of it, stop. Stop. Do I think there are more important things in the world to get riled up about? Yeah. However, there are still a lot of individuals that on principle should question following these accounts and should question supporting these accounts. Because some of these accounts then want to go on to sell these things. They want to go on to make money in some way, whether it be selling prints directly or selling things to book boxes or things like that. Now circling to the covers thing. For publishing to support this is, I think, disgusting. I cannot stand it. It puts authors in such a terrible position too. I was just talking about how even titles sometimes authors don't get to have a say in. So covers, especially, authors often don't have any say in that whatsoever. And if you're a new author, which is not always new authors, it happened, I'm pretty sure, to Christopher Paolini, and he's certainly not a new author. But when you're a newer author, you finally, after querying so many people and then finally getting an agent and then waiting and waiting and waiting for that agent to be able to pitch your work to a publisher that finally bites, and then you get some very meager advance, you have hardly anything, you still have a day job, you're working so hard, and then they slap a stupid AI cover art onto your cover, and you are now expected to promote, because you're expected to promote yourself most of the time anyway, because it's not like they're putting the money that they save towards marketing. So then you're expected to promote that only for people to get angry and sometimes want to not purchase the book, which sucks for that author. So what the heck, publisher? What are you doing? Stop! I don't understand the lack of integrity. And I think the reason this riles me up so much is because it's such an easy fix. You just hire an artist. And I recognize, especially if you're self-pub, I recognize the amount of money it takes. I don't make hardly any money. And I still, on principle, made sure to hire an artist to do the cover art for my next book, which is not me trying to pat myself on the back. It's me saying, I understand, because I'm literally there. I've done it, and I'm having to pay for it myself. I don't have the publisher to do it. So I recognize that it takes so much money. There are actually sometimes even templates, or certain artists will create a relatively generic cover that you can tweak slightly, and then you can use that. There's resources, because I know the financial angle is difficult, but publishing has no excuse. They have absolutely no excuse. I am not sorry. I'm not going to try to find any kind of maybe it would be different if. There's no reason for it. That's it. There's no reason for it. So basically, I'm saying I agree. I'm very loudly saying that I agree. I spent so much time ranting that my phone closed out, because that's what I'm reading the prompts from. It closed out, so now I gotta scroll back down and find this post again. It was my phone's way of being like, okay, come on, let's move on. People get it. The next response said, as a former cover artist, I really appreciate all the commenters who dislike AI covers. It makes my heart, and then they have a cute little emoji with the hearts around it. I did not see that I didn't see that comment at a time. I saw the very first one. But I am so glad that so many people have also taken issue with AI cover art for people like yourself. It is terrible. Next up, books that are rushed and could have used more editing. I feel like I keep seeing that critique. Churning out books seems more important than their quality, and it's a bummer because a lot of them sound like they have potential or could have been great if they were given more time in editing. Yeah, I am always really hesitant to throw out this just needed more editing critique, because what I might see as could be fixed by editing, someone else might think is completely fine. And also, I never know how much editing goes into the story. And sometimes what people are pinpointing as editing isn't actually an editing thing necessarily. So I'm usually pretty hesitant. But there have been a number of times where I'm genuinely confused about how an editor didn't, and I'm not even an expert, I'm not even close, but there are certain times, having worked with editors before, that I see the kind of work that goes into what they do, and then it confuses me when I don't feel like I'm seeing that same work done for authors. That's the whole point of people going to traditional publishing, is that they have all of the other things that they would typically have to outsource and pay for themselves. They have those things made available to them through their publishing house. So when it feels like they're not getting that, to me, it almost makes publishing feel like a scam. So I would like it if publishing really did ensure that they were putting into various different books everything that they feel that the books deserve. And I also will add, I know I'm kind of bringing in the self-pub angle on multiple prompts here, but I can kind of understand, because it's so expensive, I can give some leniency to self-pub works because of the fact that they don't have an entire giant business backing them and trying to ensure that they get all the edits. And I think in addition to both the self-pub angle and the traditional angle, what some people are banking on is that readers don't know when somebody says this was edited, that they don't know what that means, because there's different kinds of editing that can happen. And I wonder sometimes with certain books if the publisher ensured there were no typos, but they didn't do any other kind of editing at all. And some books I feel like I would have rather had some typos and then we fixed a few other things here and there. And not that it should be an either or. If you're getting a publisher to back you, the publisher should do their job of making sure that it's edited as much as it needs. I really don't think that that's a big ask, especially given how much people are paying for books. So I agree. I'm not trying to say that I think this is the case with every single book that comes out, but there have been a few times where I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Somebody said, might be an unpopular opinion, but while I do love that we are getting more special editions and sprayed edges, I feel like the market has become flooded with them. It seems like everything is getting sprayed edges and people are buying books just because they look pretty. I even have to ask myself, do I want this book because I'm interested in it or just because it's pretty and limited edition? And I really appreciate you admitting that that is something that you have to ask yourself, because I think a lot more people also ask themselves that than maybe they want to admit. So I appreciate the honesty there. And I'll admit, I had a friend that I did a book swap with where there was a book that I had read and I was going to give to them. And then they actually had been sent a book and there was apparently like a little bit of damage. And so they mentioned to the company that there was damage. So then they got another copy. So they're like, do you want this first copy I got? And I was like, sure. And when you take the sleeve off, one of the most beautiful books I have ever seen. So gorgeous. The detail that was put into this cover, this naked hardback, is incredible. The pages are beautiful. The sleeve itself is also quite pretty. And then there's artwork on the inside. And I DNF'd the book. And I'm so bummed about it. Every time I look at it, I'm like, gosh, but it's so pretty. And there is that temptation to be like, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll try it again. And it's like, no, you weren't that interested in it. You weren't that interested in it. So, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. I do like that a lot of books, we are combining different art forms. Ironic to say that when you also have the AI situation happening, but I appreciate that we have different art forms coming together to present a physical version of something. So obviously with books, you have the artwork that is the story itself. Oftentimes you're getting character art in some way, whether it be on when you first open the book or whether it be throughout the book if it's an illustrated edition, things like that. Or not just character art, it can be also locations. So then you have the artwork for that, which is amazing. Then you get on the naked hardback itself. So it's like books are pieces of art in more than one way, which I think is wonderful. But when it just feels like I only want this because it's pretty, I do think that we're starting to value that over the story itself, which maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I kind of feel like the number one thing that should matter to, well, people, whatever, can feel however they want about how they value books as art. But for me, the book's story has to come first. Next up, unremovable stickers. Why are they still a thing? It feels like going to be every single year. No, I don't know why there's still a thing. There's so many other places that have found solutions to this, because I understand that it serves a purpose. And if I understand correctly, sometimes by having the information that they have on those, it makes it so that somebody has familiarity with it and they're more likely to look at it. So if it says like as seen on Netflix or whatever, something like that, somebody will be like, oh, what's this? And then you can also put it on, I make readers seem like complete morons. Sorry. We're not morons in my opinion collectively, but anyway, our brains, we see stuff and we're like, that, I know that. What is this? So they also can then be put on displays that say things like, what is it? They often are like, soon to the screen. Well, that's definitely not what it says, but something like that. Like, something about how they're going to have adaptations, or they do have adaptations. And then you'll get a whole wall filled with, or a whole display filled with these kinds of books. So I recognize that the information might pull people in. Two things though. If it's getting an adaptation, not always, but it feels like more often than not, that book's doing all right, success-wise. I don't know if we need the sticker, you know? I feel like we're aware. Second, it doesn't have to be a sticker. It doesn't have to be a permanent sticker. It would be better if it was a regular sticker, but the permanent stickers, I have done a few videos before where I compare different editions, and sometimes I compare foreign editions, and part of the reason I do this is because I just think it's really cool to see art that is through books through different countries and to see how they represent the books. I think that's really cool. And something I have noticed is in other countries, they'll have not just a sleeve, which some countries don't even have book sleeves, but rather than that, they'll have like this, I always don't know the amount that it takes up, but I'm going to say like a quarter size of the size of the book. So the front cover is this tall, then along the bottom, they'll have this little piece of basically like paper that wraps around, and then they'll have information on that. And you can keep it if you want, and you can leave it on the book, or you can throw it away. Why, though? Do they have to have these stickers, these permanent stickers? I hate everything about tropes instead of, sorry, I missed a word in reading. I hate everything being about tropes instead of having just original themes. I understand, and I partially agree. I think that tropes are, in some ways, just capturing something that can be tied to the themes. And I think sometimes the discovery of the themes is actually really exciting. So sometimes you might be pulled in by a trope, and then you discover the themes as you go. And sometimes the themes themselves are up for debate and up for interpretation. And as such, I think it can be kind of, I wouldn't say it's a negative to reveal the themes ahead of time, but I do think that you have to be careful with that. Whereas tropes, it doesn't have to be that way if it's like, oh, chosen one, you know. And I will say, I don't think usually the synopsis will just straight up be like, chosen one bed. Like the synopsis itself doesn't usually say that. It's usually somehow in the marketing outside of the synopsis, or we've all seen where there will be a book and then around it there will be the various different things that are within the story. I think it's funny that one bed is a trope, because I'm like, isn't that a scenario that happens for maybe like a page? But anyway, the tropes thing, though, can also fall into where it's too revealing, similar to the themes that I was just talking about. Sometimes the tropes, you're like, well, now I know what happens in the book. You just told me spoilers by telling me that trope is in this. I think it's different if somebody is making a video and the video is, let's say, because this is a popular one, enemies to lovers. And in the book, or in the video, excuse me, it's assumed if you're clicking on the video, you are willingly participating in being revealed these books have enemies to lovers, depending on if the person shows the books in the thumbnail. That's another side of it. You probably have to turn the books around so that people don't know. But otherwise, when so many books just tell you through the marketing, it's going to have this in it, you're like, well, that takes some of the suspense out just a little bit. It's interesting because some people, though, like knowing this ahead of time because it provides them comfort to some degree, to have an awareness, and we all look for different things in books. But I think the core of what you're saying is that because of how the marketing has presented everything in this manner, everything's all about tropes. Not just marketing, we as readers are contributing, I think, as well. That it creates for books being sometimes feeling more shallow in their stories because it's just about fulfilling these tropes. and trying to set up to these tropes, as opposed to these tropes happening kind of organically because they just play out into the story a little bit. Like, I think to say, oh, this is dark academia, that's not necessarily, oh, I'm just trying to fill a checkbox. Somebody might genuinely have a lot of criticisms about various different places, like, you know, maybe within this fantasy world, they're exploring a character who's going to this dark academia setting. They wouldn't, I'm sure, describe it as like, this student is going to this dark academia university. That'd be fun. Somebody needs to write a very satirical book where it's literally called Dark Academia University. But point is, if you have a character who maybe has really had to work just to get into this school, and then you have other students that within this fantasy world, there's like a legacy component to it. Blood Over Bright Haven. Oh, so good. But if there is some kind of legacy component, and then you're exploring how these two characters have this sense of competitiveness to them because one of them feels like they've had to prove everything and they had to work their way here. And then slowly you start to realize that the person who is part of the like legacy family is actually incredibly skilled, and they have to feel like they have to prove it to everybody because everybody just assumes, or it's not that at all and it truly is that they're somewhat incompetent and they got in just because, or they got in because somebody's family gave a lot of money to the school, so they have to let the kid in or the school will get less money. And like, you explore all these things within the setting, which there's so much more to dark academia than just that, but you explore all these things. And so I feel like by just saying it's dark academia, that's okay. But you still want to have all those thematic elements like what you're talking about. You want those to be a combination of things. You don't want it to just be like, this is a dark academia story, and it has the blueprint of like, the school is creepy, and there's some catacombs underneath the school, and also there was sacrifices in the past. Isn't that scary? End of book. You know, it's like, okay. I mean, that just felt like everything else we've seen from dark academia before. But when that's all we need to get us to pick a book up, yeah, I can absolutely agree that it can result in there being stories that are losing, it feels like they can be losing substance sometimes. Every popular book just devolves. Okay, I'm going to avoid saying the word. You have a slash through it. Every popular book just wow. Now I can't talk at all. Every popular book just devolves into a adult film manuscript by the end. Those are the books that do really well that everyone talks about. That's true. I'm assuming you're kind of stating it. I'm assuming you don't like this. I'm assuming you're not like, I want more of this, actually, just based off of the tone of what you're saying, unless I'm completely misreading your comment here. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I just want it to be clear. If it's very clear that it is primarily smut, I just want it to be made clear that it's primarily smut. If it is, actually, I should be clear for myself that I have seen discussions about the difference between fantasy romance, romantasy, romance fantasy, and smut. There are conversations where people who really are rigid about what those things entail get annoyed at people who kind of use those terms interchangeably. But one thing I saw, sorry, Luna's drinking water if you hear that. One thing I saw is that for one of them, they said that romance fantasy versus fantasy romance, like fantasy romance is like historical romance, where it's at its core, it's romance, it's just the setting is told to you by that first word. So in the case of fantasy romance, it's a romance with a fantasy setting. Whereas romance fantasy is a fantasy book with a romantic subplot. And I'm like, that's most fantasy though. Does that make sense? Why, like, my confusion? Because I'm like, but that's most fantasy. Mistborn, by that definition, is a romance fantasy, right? Because there is a romantic subplot. It's not the A plot. I don't even know if you'd call it the B plot, but there is an element to it that has a romance, as do most fantasy books. There are the exceptions. Like, I've made a video before about fantasy books that, for the most part, basically don't have any romantic plot lines, as well as stories that I think have romantic plot lines, but they're not necessarily fantasy romance books. But I will admit I'm confused. And so that's on me. I need to look into it further. And then if I am seeing, like, I'm wrong, about how I've been using them interchangeably, then I need to be better about that, and then I need to do what I can as a reviewer to use those terms properly. I'm just admitting right now, I'm a little confused, and I will extend that some of that confusion feels like it's because of how things are marketed, which I'm not trying to pass off blame to publishing, like, I know it's kind of my fault, but it's not really, it's publishing's fault. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just saying, I don't even feel like publishing is using those rigid definitions. I think publishing is like, here's this fantasy book, and you pick it up and you're like, this is definitely fantasy romance though. This is a fantasy romance. And then other times it's like, here's this really sweet, loving fantasy, and it's like very smutty. I was about to give more details and I won't. But sometimes it's a little hard to tell, especially because the covers, sometimes it's like a crown, you know? It's a crown or a sword, and you're like, okay, that seems like it could be anything. So I'm not in disagreement, just to be clear. It does seem like those are the ones that get popular, which is fine. I just think none of us are quite, or maybe all of us are not on the same page. We're on different pages of what these terms mean and what they entail and how we describe them when we give recommendations. Oh, another, I hate the use of AI in marketing or for book covers. I am over shadow daddies and romancy being 450 plus pages. I have liked the rise of self-publishing and fantasy. I've discovered some great series due to them being more popular on social media. Oh, yay, a happy one. So I agree with the first statements. We have kind of talked about some of that. The shadow daddy thing, I feel like is, maybe you can tie that into the tropes conversation. But yeah, I absolutely love that it feels like people are taking self-pub works more seriously. I know that some of what's been discussed feels like it's picking on fantasy romance, which isn't hopefully how any of it came across. I'm more just like confused about the categorizations, but I do want to applaud. I definitely feel like fantasy romance readers absolutely have helped with that because they're willing to get their stories wherever they find them. I don't think there is this sense of snobbery. And I wonder if it's because for so long, fantasy romance didn't do well in publishing, and now that it is doing well, they're seeing this renaissance. But up until that point, if you wanted fantasy romance, you went on like Kindle Unlimited and you were supporting self-pub authors. I do think, regardless though, that there has absolutely been more push for people to take seriously self-pub works, which makes me so excited. There's a lot of individuals who deserve the credit for that, both the authors who are putting in a lot of the work as well as reviewers who are putting in the time and effort to discover these. I did a video on World Hoppers, my collaborative channel, discussing various different self-pub books, and the two individuals in that, I'll have them linked here as well, but that is their bread and butter. They check out so many self-pub works. So definitely, if you're interested in more self-pub, that video, you'll get lots of recommendations from there. And I'll continue to do what I can to read and discuss and review self-pub works because I'm in complete agreement. There have been some really great ones. Lack of editing in books. Oh, romantasy. Okay. I miss political fantasy books. Oh, me. I mean, I was going to say me too, but do I feel like I still read them? I'm not sure. I feel like the political fantasy that I like, oftentimes, Luna is grumbling if you're hearing those noises. The political fantasy I like is somewhat usually woven in with epic fantasy. Like, I like when you're on the edge of your seat because you're like, wait a second, it was just a small statement, but I feel like that has serious implications for this other kingdom over here. And I just love that kind of stuff. I think it's so exciting, and it just feels like every little thing had so many consequences possible from them. I love that kind of political fantasy, and I agree that I don't think we're getting as much of it. I will admit, a while back, somebody said they actually don't like politics in fantasy, and they feel like it's in everything. So maybe it's just the degree to which the politics is within. Cartoony book covers that have adult content. Okay, there's some responses. Somebody said this: as much as we made fun of the painted bodice ripper covers or the 50 Shades style prop on cover with mood lighting, those styles pretty clearly communicated that something about the book was erotic. Many of these cartoon covers are communicating closed-door rom-com instead of the content. The cute rom-com is great, but sometimes you want something cute and sometimes you want to get your rocks off. Someone else agreed. They said these books should at least have a spice warning on the cover or something. And then someone said, I railed against the cartoon covers for a couple of years. Don't know when it happened, but I prefer them now. Oh, interesting change of heart. My goodness, Luna Bear is so grumbly right now. I don't know why. She just keeps laying down and then flopping over and making noise. And then she sits back up and looks at me. And then I think she wants belly rubs. I will give them to her after, I promise, in case anybody's worried. The cartoon covers. I think that I would be kind of interesting if there was more transparency about the levels of spice. But I also think this gets into the conversation about the level of content in general, like how explicit the content is. And then that leads into ratings, not obviously like a 5-star rating, not that kind of rating, but the conversation about should books have ratings as far as this is for, 12 and under, this is 13 and over, this is 18 and over. Should they have those? And I feel like it starts to lean into that, which that's its own thing. And then you have inevitably the push for if it turns out something's popular. So let's say the more steamy types of stories are more popular, then you might have authors encouraged to put that in. Whereas if it's not as popular, you have authors encouraged to take it out, even though maybe that's what they want to put in because it serves some kind of purpose within their story, or it's just what they want to do. So I think that the cutesy covers, in a way, can convey to the point that is being made here. They can convey, this is going to be more rom-com cutesy. But there have been times that they have the rom-com cutesy covers, and you're like, whoa, this is getting pretty intense. And I feel like we just need to find a way to maybe not have the bodice ripper covers like what was mentioned, but maybe also have the art a little more clearly indicate what you're likely to get with the book you're picking up. This is something I'm not as familiar with, but somebody said, I miss when Book Talk was full of reading sprints. It was such a vibe to tune in and read with someone random. Aw, that's nice. I don't know if I knew that was a thing for Book Talk. I host reading sprints over on World Hoppers, roughly about once every other week, if you're looking to join in on some more sprints. But I didn't know that was a thing on Book Talk, and I am sad for you that doesn't seem to be as prominent. Luna's sad for you as well. I love cozy, casual romantasy books. My favorite reads this year were the House Witch series. I highly recommend this book series for cozy romantasy lovers. Oh, okay. That sounds cute. I like cozy romantasy, even though I'm not sure, as I admitted, what is romantasy versus fantasy romance. I don't know. But I like the idea of a love story that is also cozy. That sounds very sweet and cute. So I will have to look into the House Witch. That sounds lovely. I miss epic, sci-fi, and fantasy being the meat of the genre. I love the genre blends and the cozy and the exploration of many niches. I'm going to restart. I miss epic, sci-fi, and fantasy being the meat of the genre. I love the genre blends and the cozy and the exploration of many niches, but I wish that didn't come with the loss of space in modern publishing for the heart of why we fell in love with these genres in the first place. It feels like it's being hollowed out in traditional publishing spaces. We did already kind of touch on this, but I still wanted to read that response because I think you captured the feeling very well of, I like all these other things, but I feel we're starting to abandon this other. To be honest, I dislike the fast fashion style books. I don't care what story or trope or trend, because even if I like the trend, if it feels like it needed longer in the oven, it's no good. For things I do like, to be honest, I'm not tired of the morally gray love interest yet, if they are a proper developed love interest and not just basic cardboard for an equally bland heroine. I'm gonna add something to your second part about the morally gray love interest, and you're saying as long as they're not a cardboard and they're actually done well. I think that statement, the as long as it's not the cookie cutter thing you're always seeing and it's actually well developed, is true for most tropes and our feelings toward them. I know in conversations like these, in a quick comment, it's probably quicker to say like, oh, I can't stand this trope. And When maybe if you were to dig a little deeper, what people are saying is, I don't like that it's this trope in everything and there's no substance to it. It's just there because it's popular and they want to slap it on marketing and they want to put it in the Instagram posts and the TikTokers want to be able to say it's got this and then that's it. That you actually just like, you want a good story in it. That trope doesn't maybe actually bother you. You just need the substance to be there. So I think your statement about the love interest, I also don't get tired of that kind of character. I actually think the enemies to lovers one maybe better fits what I'm describing because it's everywhere. And so many people, myself included, have pointed out sometimes it's like two characters interact and they're kind of like, I don't really like that guy. And that's it. And that's enough to be like enemies to lovers. You're like, that's not enemies to lovers. That's just, I was in a mood that day and then they didn't make it better. That's not enemies. We're running fast and loose with that word, I feel. It's like if somebody were saying like, that's my nemesis. And it's just like their neighbor who one time accidentally like bumped their trash can or something where you're like, that's not a nemesis. That's just a person who did one thing once that irritated you. So I just feel like enemies to lovers, if done well, is incredible because, man, I always end up going off on this. But what it can do and the way it can show how the world divides us and how we can overcome the divisions that are almost placed on us oftentimes before we're even born, just through history, rhetoric, through our culture, and through society. And then when people can come together and realize those things come second to how we are as people and what we see as important in our principles. And it turns out we have more in common than we thought. And then when that can turn into mutual respect, which can turn into attraction, it's like, yeah, that's a compelling plot line, potentially. But if it's just the like, I don't really like them thing, then what is that? That's not enemies. So point is, I agree with you. I just used a different example. I love the Empire of the Wolf trilogy so much. Juan. Hey, I do too. That's not really a trend, but yeah, shout out to Empire of the Wolf. Naked men on romance covers. Like, we all know the man inside is going to be described as being tall with a six-pack. We don't need to have a picture depicted on the front. We can imagine him for ourselves. Be original for once, please. I've always hated enemies to lovers. Oh, this will be perfect to see. Okay, I don't mind when it's simple, like the cheerleader and the nerdy boy going from enemies to lovers. However, these days it's more he murdered her husband and burned her father's house and they became lovers afterwards. Sheesh, it's hard to get behind the more toxic elements of enemies to lovers. I love that this came up because I had no idea that this was there, and that is the other side of the enemies to lovers coin that I didn't mention. So I don't like when that term is used for the basic stuff, which actually it feels like you would prefer that. I like when it's as I described, but what you're talking about, I agree with. And I'm glad you presented that because that is a side that is very popular these days where you basically have like a murderer and a murderer who murdered someone the love interest cared about. And then it's like, but also, as the previous person mentioned, but like they're hot and they're tall and they have a six-pack. So I don't know, maybe my dad would have forgiven me for loving this man. You're like, no, I don't think he would have, actually. Maybe not. I don't think so. It just, I don't really understand. I don't really understand. There's almost a part of me, I'm curious your thoughts on this. Maybe somebody can expand. I almost feel like you are taking funny fandom ships and you're like, but what if that's actually what the story was? Except for that's what we're getting all the time now. And it's almost like you don't let us have our funny fandom ships. And in theory, I like the idea. The idea of people are like, who are the two most unlikely characters to be together? It'd be kind of, I kind of ship them. When people have those reactions. Okay, that's kind of funny. And it's just like weird headcanon. Not actually literally, but it's just like this weird little thing that they imagine. But when you actually think about how that would play out, you're like, I mean, that wouldn't make for a very good story. Except for like, that's actually the story we're getting. So then it's kind of almost like tapping into this part of ourselves that in the past we almost felt like, I can't tell people I ship these characters unless I'm friends with them and then I can tell them because they know who I am as a person and that I'm not literally being serious, but also maybe I'm kind of serious. Like there's those darker sides to our imaginations and it feels like we're really expanding on that. And I'm not opposed to that in theory, but there's something about it, maybe just because it's so common now that it doesn't feel like, maybe this is a weird example. How many of you as kids took the ladder out of the pool in The Sims so that the Sim character couldn't get out of the pool and then drowned and died? How many of you did that with your Sims characters? Okay, what if that was the whole game? You'd be like, yeah, this isn't fun to just kill these characters constantly. Like, that can't be all this game is. But when you allow, what if I took the door out of the room and they got stuck and they starved to death? Why? I don't know why as children we did that kind of twisted stuff, but it remained this just weird thing in our heads that we laughed at with our siblings and our friends. I wonder now what this is. Please tell me other people did this, right? I'm not the only one. If I am, I'm just kidding. Like I said, what if that was the whole game? What if it was create your character, build their house, watch them die? You would be like, I kind of wanted to watch them flourish in their career. Anyway, my point is just, I guess it's okay from time to time to explore the weird directions our brains go. However, we don't always need to. I think that's what I'm getting at. Books marketed as certain genres when they actually aren't that genre. So many books I have read have been marketed as fantasy or horror and then just had a fantasy setting or horror elements, and it's so annoying. I think as more stories start to blend genres, we're going to see a lot more of this. And the ones, okay, maybe this is just me being snarky. The ones that do well, I feel like inevitably are going to get shelved under fiction. And then the ones that aren't as popular will go into the genre, like it'll go into fantasy or it'll go into horror. Because I've noticed that before. There are certain books that once they reach a certain level of popularity, they stop being sold in fantasy and they start being shelved under fiction. I think Ninth House is an example. Jonathan Strange and is it Norrell? I thought it was Norrell, but I think one of my friends said it's Norrell. The Aaron Morgenstern, The Night Circus, that one, not shelved as fantasy. It's usually shelved in fiction and often pops up on best of fantasy lists. And you're like, why isn't it in fantasy then? Anyway, enemies to lovers, specifically in romantasy. They're not enemies, they're not lovers. They're just freaking stupid. I like that comment. I'm really done with trope marketing. Please leave something as a surprise. Why does every book need sprayed edges now? So I think it just seems like you're not into it, which is understandable. I love romantasy, but I'm so sick of that being the only type of fantasy books being pushed everywhere. In the Target fantasy section, they only have romantasy. I just want fantasy sometimes. Yeah, I agree. For those of us who have Targets in the places that we live. I don't buy books from Target. Basically ever, because I don't know. I don't need to get into that. I try for the most part to go to my indie bookstores. That's not an option for everybody. And I'm not trying to condemn anybody who buys books from Target. But usually I'm just like, I'm okay. To me, Target's book selection, sometimes there's stuff that I like, but it tends to be whatever the most successful, most popular things are. And often in fantasy circles, now there isn't really a distinction for places like Target between fantasy and fantasy romance. It's just like, well, fantasy romance as well, so we'll just put that here. I'm tired of books that are written mostly YA, except for one sex scene that really feels out of place to make it an adult romance. Guys, there's nothing wrong with YA. Just because I'm an adult, that I won't like it because it's YA. Oh, I think there's a word missing. That doesn't mean that I won't like it because it's YA. Stop trying to force it, please. I like the rise of self-publishing, though. That's been great to see. Another fan of that. I agree. We need YA books. YA books are important for a number of reasons. And if adults are reading YA books, the same reason that adults can watch kids' movies applies to young adult books and middle grade books. I would certainly hope there's nothing in middle grade. But the idea being that if something is made primarily for kids and young teens, adults can still enjoy that content. I wonder if that's because for a long time, the people who were reviewing and reading YA books were adults. They're the ones spending their money on it. And then those individuals are getting older and older and older, and they're wanting certain kinds of content from the books that they read. And instead of being able to find that in other places, which is much easier to do now, but instead of finding it in these other places, they kind of just wanted the age range they were reading from to adapt to them. And then it did, and now it's created some of these weird in between where you're like, well, I get that it's shelved as adult, but for the most part that was thematically more young adult, writing, story, there's a lot of things about it that feel like it's more applicable to the young adult experience. There were a few other ones that I didn't get around to, so if you'd like to check out what was left from that post, I'll have the link so you can go check it out if you're interested, and if you want to elaborate on anything that we talked about here, feel free to do so. But as always, thank you to everybody who submitted a response. It is through your responses that we're able to have these conversations and really tackle them from different angles or laugh about them from different angles, whatever the case may be. I'm really grateful for the participation that all of you put in. It was certainly more negative than positive. There weren't too many trends that we're happy about, which is okay, that we didn't necessarily only talk about good things. We primarily talked about some of our gripes. Sometimes you just gotta vent and get that stuff out. And I don't mind at all that it primarily skewed that way, because there are a lot of things that certainly I think a lot of us aren't the biggest fans of, and it was good to be able to have a conversation about it. Don't forget to check out that wonderful artist, because they're amazing, and let's support real artists and real art. I think a lot of you would really like a lot of the other pieces besides just the ones that I showed here. They're so lovely, so I'll have them linked as well. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Luna is still continuing to grumble, so I'm going to officially go pet her belly, and I'll see you all later. Bye. Little Miss Luna Bear. Hello. Why are you being such a grumbly girl? Now you don't want to look at the camera? There's your sweet little face. Luna? Oh my gosh. Luna, do you want a snacky? Oh, yeah, now you'll look? Now you'll look? Okay, well, I gotta follow through. Yeah, okay, let's go. Yeah, let's go.